Something happened. Maybe yesterday. Maybe this morning. And what's sitting with you now isn't really what was said. It's that you went from zero to everything, faster than you could stop it. And then the look on their face, that specific moment where you could see them go somewhere else. And you wanted to explain it, to say something that would undo it. But the words that came out weren't the ones you needed. So now you're here, replaying it, trying to understand what happened. Wondering, again, why this keeps happening. Here is what this video is going to do. It's going to explain the mechanism behind what happened, not as an excuse, but as a description that is actually true. By the end, you will understand something specific about how your brain processes emotion, something that was almost certainly never explained to you. And that understanding is going to change what the last outburst means. Not erase it, change it. Before anyone called it ADHD, before there was any framework at all, there was a different explanation for what you were doing. It probably arrived early. A teacher who noted you were sensitive. A parent who said you overreacted. A friend who told you, kindly or not, that you were a lot. Too emotional, too dramatic, too intense for what the situation called for. And here is what happens when a label like that arrives young enough. It doesn't stay as a description of one moment. It becomes the framework for every moment that follows. Every time the reaction came faster than you could manage, every time the emotion was louder than the room seemed to expect, you already had an explanation waiting. You filed it under the same heading. More evidence. Same verdict. Research on emotional dysregulation in ADHD, particularly in girls who were high-functioning, high-masking, shows a consistent pattern. The emotional intensity was always visible. The neurological cause was almost never identified. What that means, in practice, is this. The symptom got named as character. The cause stayed invisible. So let's ask the question that probably never got asked. What if the explanation you were given, the one that arrived first, was simply wrong? Not incomplete, not partially true, wrong about what it was measuring. Here is what is actually happening in the ADHD brain when emotion arrives. The brain registers emotional input at full intensity, not slightly heightened. Full. Faster than a neurotypical brain, and louder. The signal arrives at a volume that the nervous system has to respond to. That part is not the problem. The intensity of the emotion is not the problem. The problem is what happens next. Or more precisely, what doesn't. In a neurotypical brain, there is a modulation process. The emotional signal arrives, and before it exits as behavior, before it becomes words or a reaction or a door closing, there is a fraction of a second where the prefrontal cortex steps in. It doesn't eliminate the emotion, it regulates the response. It is, essentially, a brake. In the ADHD brain, that brake is subject to the same executive dysfunction as everything else. The same system that makes it hard to start a task, hard to hold a sequence, hard to filter what's relevant. That system is also responsible for modulating emotional response, which means, when the emotion arrives at full volume, the brake that would pace the response before it exits is delayed, sometimes significantly, sometimes entirely absent in that moment. This is not a choice. It is not lack of effort. It is the same executive dysfunction, operating on emotion instead of tasks. Russell Barkley, one of the researchers who has studied ADHD most extensively, has been documenting for years that emotional dysregulation is not a side effect of ADHD, not a comorbidity. It is a core feature of how the ADHD brain is organized. It was in the room the whole time. Nobody put it in the explanation you received. And that gap between what was always true and what you were actually told is exactly where the shame moved in. Now let's look at what that gap actually cost. Here is the specific damage that gap caused. The label "too emotional" didn't just describe the outburst. It became the evidence you used to prosecute yourself. Every relationship rupture. Every time you watched someone go quiet after you reacted. Every apology that felt like it wasn't enough. Because you were apologizing for the reaction. But what you were really trying to apologize for was the person you were afraid you were. All of it went into the file. Decades of entries. Same heading. Proof of character. And here's what makes that so hard to hold now. The mechanism was always neurological. The verdict was always personal. Those are not the same thing. They were never the same thing. But no one drew the line between them clearly enough for you to see it. It makes complete sense that you internalized the label. It arrived before you had any other framework. It was confirmed, repeatedly, by people whose opinion of you mattered. And it explains something that genuinely needed explaining, even if the explanation was wrong about what it was measuring. She wasn't too emotional. She was underexplained. The intensity was real. The emotion was real. The speed of it, the volume of it, the difficulty of stopping it, all of that was real. What was not real was the verdict that those things added up to a character flaw. What was not real was the conclusion that this was who you are, rather than how your brain is organized. The outburst last week is not evidence. The one before it is not evidence. 30 years of them, accumulated in the file you've been keeping, not evidence. Navigation, without a map that was accurate. The too emotional label is one of 5 specific false beliefs that the workbook linked in the description works through directly. 8 sessions, 15 to 20 minutes each. Not a system to maintain, a belief to examine, one layer at a time at whatever pace fits. If this video opens something you want to go deeper on, that's where to go next. Link is in the description. So what changes now that you understand the mechanism? Understanding the mechanism doesn't undo the last conversation. It doesn't remove the apology you already made or change what happened in the room, but it changes 3 specific things. And those 3 things matter. The first is what you say to yourself in the aftermath. Right now, the default is the verdict. Something happened, right? Pointing arrow. The file opens, right? Pointing arrow. More evidence, right? Pointing arrow. Same conclusion. What the mechanism gives you is a different entry point. Something happened, right? Pointing arrow. The break was delayed, right? Pointing arrow. The response exited before it could be modulated, right? Pointing arrow. That is what ADHD emotional dysregulation looks like in practice. That is not a softer version of the truth. That is a more accurate version of it. The second thing that changes is recognition before the exit. The break cannot always be strengthened. That's the honest version. But the physiological state that precedes the moment the break fails, the particular quality of tension that arrives in the body before the response exits that can be learned. Not to stop it every time. Not to perform control you don't have, but to begin to recognize the signal, which gives you slightly more than you had before, and slightly more is not nothing. It is, actually, where all real change begins. The third thing that changes is what you can say to the people in your life, not as an excuse. An excuse would be, I can't help it, so it doesn't count. An explanation is different. An explanation says, here is what is actually happening in my brain. Here is why the response comes faster than I can always intercept. Here is what I am working with. Accurately named. The relationship is not in danger because you can't control your emotions. The relationship is in danger because neither of you has had the right explanation yet. That can change. And the internal objection that probably arrived somewhere in this video, but other people manage their emotions, so ADHD isn't an excuse, that objection is worth answering directly. Other people have a break that fires differently. Not because they are more disciplined, not because they want to regulate more than you do, because the system that runs the break is organized differently in their brain. Knowing that is not an excuse. It is the accurate description of a neurological difference. What you do with that description, how you work with it, how you communicate it, how you begin to recognize the signals that is still yours to navigate. But you navigate it from the right starting place now, not from the verdict, from the mechanism. If what this video opened feels like something you want to go further with, the workbook in the description is built for exactly this. The beliefs that were constructed from years of the wrong explanation. Link in the description and in the pinned comment. What was the moment you first suspected the too emotional label might have been measuring the wrong thing and not actually describing who you are? There are years in this, years of filing the evidence, years of the apology that felt insufficient because you were apologizing for more than what happened. You were apologizing for what you were afraid it proved. The jobs that went sideways before you knew why. The relationships that carried the weight of the moments you couldn't intercept. The version of yourself you kept almost becoming, and then watching yourself undo. Knowing this doesn't give those years back. It doesn't make the last conversation not have happened. But it does change what they mean. They were not proof of character. They were a neurological feature, specific, documented, real, operating for years without the right name. The break was always delayed. The verdict was never accurate, and the accumulation you've been carrying, that private record of every time the response came too fast, every look on every face, that was never evidence of who you are. It was navigation. Without a map that told the truth, you have a more accurate map now. It doesn't change the terrain, but it changes where you think you are on it. And that quietly, without drama, is not a small thing. Not evidence. Navigation. She was never the problem. Neither are you.